So this is the last of this series of lectures from the Nack Network for Nanotechnology Workforce Education on materials overview for nanotechnology. And this is their lecture 5, which is classifying materials by structure. So when we talk about structure, we're limiting ourselves to materials in the solid phase, right? Because liquids and gases don't really have a specific structure because they could really flow, um, flow around. So by structure, we mean the position of the material's atoms or molecules with respect to one another. There are three basic structural organizations a material's atoms or molecules can possess in a solid. And those three basic structural organizations are crystalline, a single crystal, polycrystalline, which are many crystals. It could be of the same material, but many different crystals like hooked together, and amorphous, which is not crystalline anywhere. So we'll talk about those three organizational structures. Crystalline materials are when the atoms are arranged in a regular, repetitive, grid-like pattern in all dimensions. The surroundings of each specific type of atom or molecule are identical. Crystalline materials can be brittle like silicon wafers when they have covalent bonding. At the other extreme, crystalline materials can be malleable like gold when they have metallic bonding. So they have a pretty wide range of properties. I'll often think, although it's not exclusive, but I'll oftentimes think of crystalline structures as inorganic. So table salt is inorganic. It has sodium and chlorine, sodium and chlorine in it. So sodium would be the green atoms and chlorine would be the purple atoms. And see how they're just positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, just attached to each other. And it makes a really nice cube structure. So if you ever look at a salt crystal under a microscope, you could see oftentimes they're little perfectly shaped cubes, like as if some little tiny like fairy or something came in and cut it into cube shapes. And this occurs naturally. Nobody came in and cut it in this way. That's just the way it's formed because of the way the atoms like to line up. Another crystalline material are silicon wafers. And in this case, silicon. And in this case, every single atom is a silicon atom, right? And they line up in a certain way. And when they make the silicon wafers, which are used for semiconductors, for chips and stuff, they have to make sure that there's no impurities. There's nothing else in there except for silicon, which is very difficult and very rare. They have to, manufacture it that way really specifically. And that every single atom is lined up the way they want it to be lined up. So they can determine how it's lined up. So that when they cut the little sheets of silicon, the atoms are lined up exactly the way they want it to. If they're not, we'll talk about this just a tad a little bit later. The electrical properties are completely like wrong. So you have to line it up exactly the way you want it to for the chips to work properly. So in order to be able to communicate and understand how the atoms are exactly positioned and lined up, we use certain terms like unit cells and lattice structure. So a unit cell is the basic structure which, when repeated, builds up a crystal. And the positions of the atoms or molecules follow a lattice and a recipe within the unit. So the lattice structure is how the unit is put together, and the unit is the smallest, I guess, group of atoms that, if repeated, can be repeated over and over again. So these boxy things here are each are unit cells, right? And of different lattice structures, just to kind of give an example. So let's see. I want to show something specific. Let's look at the, I don't know if you could look at the cubic. Well, let's look at these two, monoclinic, right? Monoclinic. So one lattice structure is like this, where it has atoms located at the corners of this kind of rectangular prism. The other structure has atoms at the corners of the rectangular prism, but also in the center of the top and the bottom of this structure, right? If you look at this orthorhombic, again, you have one, the simple, which just has atoms at the corner. The base centered has it at the top and the bottom face also. The body centered has atoms at the corners and one right in the middle of the cubic structure thing there. And the face centered has atoms at the corners and at each, like the surface, the middle of the surface of each of the sides, right? So depending on what your material is that is in the crystal structure, it could have just atoms at the corners or in between, et cetera, et cetera. There, oopsies, there are different like basic structures, cubic, tetragonal, triclinic, and you can see that they're have different positions of where the atoms are. X-ray, I wanted to keep this slide in because it notes that X-ray diffraction is a very useful tool for determining if a material is crystalline, because then you can see the actual structure, the lattice parameters of the crystal, and for single crystals, the exact 3D arrangement of atoms or molecules can be calculated for measured X-ray diffraction intensities. So pretty interesting way to analyze, crystal structures. All right. So the structures that well, it's a drawing, but the cartoon drawing structures that I saw you here of sodium chloride, and this is of silicon, right? There's no defects. They're all sodium chloride, sodium chloride, sodium chloride, or silicon, silicon, silicon. But in real life, there are defects that happen in your crystal structures. And they have different names for them. So this one is a substitutional defect. Really, the defect names are exactly like what the actual defect is. So substitutional defect. So I think this S should be SI. So this is probably a silicon. Well, maybe not, since it's in squares. But anyway, silicon structure or S structure, where they put like a P in one of the spots where an S should be, right? There's a P there, different element where it should be all S's. Okay. So that can happen on purpose if you're doping a semiconductor on purpose, or if it's accidental, that can mess up your material. But that's one defect, a substitutional defect. Another type of defect is called interstitial. So it's interstitial. It's inside, where it's supposed to be. Oh, this one, these are supposed to be SIs. So it's in between there. Another one is called a vacancy, where there's supposed to be an atom right here in this hole, but it's missing. And slip dislocation. So right where, like, this is supposed to continue to go across, straight across, but for whatever reason, this little section like moved out of place, right? So if I were able to like drag this down, it would be right in line. But for some reason, at one of these normal spots here where the atoms are lined up, it just kind of moved. So a slip dislocation. Well, this one almost looks like it could be something like polycrystalline, but polycrystalline orientations can even be more drastic, are when many different crystal orientations are within a given solid. The polycrystalline structures possess order within that crystal, which is called a grain. The change over the region between one crystal and another is called the grain boundary. interfaces and grain boundaries are areas of higher free energy versus single crystal. So here's an example of a polycrystalline material. So this is the same material, except for they have different crystals. You can see that the organization is different crystals within it. Polycrystalline materials can be used in solar cells, for example. Here, I don't know what they did to be able to see this, but you can see there's a bunch of different crystals in there. Whereas in semiconductors, you have to not have polycrystalline. It has to be a single crystal for semiconductor wafers. The last structural type is called amorphous. Amorphous is when the solid material lacks any repetitive structure and demonstrates structural disorder at the atomic or molecular level. So when I think of amorphous structures, I think of maybe like spaghetti. You know how it's all like cooked spaghetti, not raw spaghetti. Raw spaghetti is more like a crystalline structure, but cooked spaghetti, how it's all like intertwined and all mixed up, that's more like an amorphous structure. Amorphous structures have no long-range order. There's no such thing as a grain or grain boundary in an amorphous solid. In some older literature, the term has been used synonymously with glass, but nowadays, amorphous solid is considered to be overarching concept, and glass is more of a special case. A glass is an amorphous solid that transforms into a liquid upon heating through the glass transition temperature, which we haven't really talked about that at all. So you don't have to worry about that. But basically, amorphous means there's no kind of like repetitive structure. So this kind of gives you a nice visual example of the different types. So crystalline, the entire solid is arranged in an orderly fashion, right? It's all like kind of lined up nice and neat. Polycrystalline, within each section, it's nice and orderly, but outside, but the whole thing isn't orderly amongst itself. So complete short range order in segments. Okay. And some of these dots might be off because I might have moved some stuff in the slideshow. Amorphous is no recognizable long range order. So these are all totally like mixed up, right? Like cooked spaghetti might be. Different structures can be maybe present in the same material. For example, organic solids containing crystalline and amorphous regions. Some of the polymer molecules constituting this solid are found in both regions. So you have a crystalline region, and then you have an amorphous region. And when I used to work at GE Research Center, where I worked with plastics and polymers, they sometimes specifically do this because when you have the crystals in there, you can increase the temperature at which this plastic will melt. So that's sometimes a good thing. You might also increase the material's ability to resist different chemicals by putting crystalline regions and amorphous regions in the same material. So there are property reasons why you might do that. Oh, this was the solar cell device physics. Huh. So I guess, I don't know if that has something to do with solar cells, but in plastics, I know they do that on purpose often. And then, the density, how much crystalline versus non-crystalline material is in there can change the properties, etc. So single crystal, polycrystalline, and amorphous can affect properties, but so can the size scale. Size effects and nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are generally thought of as being less than 100 nanometers. They can be amorphous, polycrystalline, or crystalline. So why does that matter? Well, we talked about this, I think, in the other project. The electron distributions and allowed energy levels in a nano-sized particle can be different than that of the corresponding bulk solid. So this is a bulk solid here where you have repeats going in all directions, like many, 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 many times. So it's bulk versus a nanoparticle. And you notice, I think these circles represent the, electron cloud of that atom. And so Many of the electrons can have distorted electron clouds due to the high surface to volume ratio of the nanoparticle. So on the surface, these electrons clouds might be influenced by something else. So in this case, like half of your electrons have this weird shape versus compared to the inner atoms, versus on the bulk, they all basically look the same. If small enough, you can also have quantum effects. Quantum size effects can show up in very small nanoparticles. When quantum size effects are present, the impact, say for a crystalline nanoparticle, for example, can be changes in catalytic, electrical, and optical properties compared to those of the bulk counterpart. Also, I remember years ago that one of my students researched the use of, I think, hafnium nanocrystals in cancer treatment, so that you can inject the tumor with these nanocrystals and then shine not a light like a flashlight, but some sort of radiation on it, and it concentrates the radiation to the tumor. The hafnium crystals do. And that way you could use a lower energy source and get the same results. So you don't damage as much of the healthy tissue around that tumor. So besides electrical, optical, and catalytic properties, I think there can be other properties that are affected as well. Returning back to bulk solids, properties can be different in different planes and different directions in bulk crystalline solids. Okay, so this is, I think this is, we're going to start talking briefly about, the electrical properties based on the way the atoms are structured. So here is a nanoscale structure of a single crystal table salt, right? You saw that before. Also, this is a nanoscale structure in a plane of single crystal silicon. So if you cut it in a certain way, this is what like the two-dimensional nanostructure will look like. If you cut it in this other way, it'll look like this. You could see that they're different, right? And if you cut it another way, it'll look like this, where it's six-sided, almost flowery looking positioning of the atoms. Each of these different planes, right, will have different properties. In particular, if it's, well, I guess I'm thinking graphite or silicon, the way the electrical conductivity works. So it's important, I think, for the scientists to know exactly, what plane, what type of structure it is, and if they're going to cut it, what plane it's being cut at. This slide just quickly reviews the different definitions and terms of materials. So nanoparticles, crystalline, amorphous, polycrystalline, in the nanoscale, the microscale. I'm sure when I was working at GE, it was in the microscale for sure, and polycrystalline, multicrystalline. How do engineers, scientists, technicians describe planes and directions in a crystal to one another? Okay, so this is, yeah, because if I were an engineer or scientist or technician, and I want to describe, one of these three planes, right? How am I going to do that? Because it doesn't really work well if I say, oh, this kind of flowery looking shape, or, this diamond shape. What do you mean by that? It could be a bunch of different things. So how do we talk about it? We use a thing called Miller indices. And that is, can that possibly be the last slide? I guess it is. So I should have cut that Miller index thing one out, but there are ways, very specific ways to describe the crystal structure. And we will get into that, I think, in another project. So that brings us to the end of lecture number 5.